thank you all for coming to my lecture. Good evening, and thank you, everyone. My name is Connor Brinton, and I'm the founder and chairman of Grand Canyon University's Young Americans for Freedom chapter. On behalf of the Young Americas Foundation and GCU, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you and the thousands joining us online to Why We Need Both Faith and Reason, presented by Ben Shapiro. But first, let me give you some background. YAF was founded in 1962 for the purpose of increasing the number of young Americans who are exposed to conservative ideas. Then in 1998, YAF saved the Reagan Ranch, and they now use it to pass on the conservative ideals that Ronald Reagan so strongly believed in. It was after I was able to visit the Reagan Ranch that I was motivated to found a Young Americans for Freedom chapter. There were only 3 of us at our first meeting. We started advertising our club using posters like this that said #BringBen. From the beginning, our goal was to bring conservative thought to campus, and we've been honored to host several national speakers, including Andrew Klavan, Michael Knowles, and Ali Stuckey. But the question I always got asked was, when are you guys going to bring Ben Shapiro? Well, GCU YAF, we did it. We brought Ben. Promises made, promises kept, am I right? As I look out over the 1,800 attending tonight and think about the thousands more joining us online, I can't help but be filled with gratitude. I want to thank our many GCU YAF members for all their hard work in representing our club and hosting this event. You guys seriously are great, so thank you. I also want to thank the National YAF leadership for their support along the way. Their assistance in overcoming opposition was instrumental in making tonight happen. I'd also like to thank Fred Allen for sponsoring this lecture series and for our local donors for their support. Without you guys, we couldn't do any of this. Thanks to all the GCU staff, especially the event services and public safety teams who have helped us put on this event. And I'd like to include Phoenix Police Department for helping out. That was really great. In addition, I'd like to thank those of you in the community who have helped us defend free speech on our campus. Thanks to all of you, opponents of free speech will think twice about silencing conservative points of view. I personally want to thank Ben Shapiro for choosing to come to Grand Canyon University. Out of the thousands of schools who applied to hear him speak, we are thankful to have you in Lope Country tonight, Ben. And finally, I want to thank God, for without him, nothing is possible, but through him, we can hope to achieve the seemingly impossible. For tonight's presentation, we ask everyone to be respectful. If you attempt to disrupt the lecture or the Q&A, you will be removed immediately from the venue. I love this. So please, for the Q&A, form a line that'll be right over here. Keep your questions brief so we can hear from as many students as possible. Also, if you're interested in getting involved with GCU YAF, or you just want some premium content in your feed, feel free to follow us at GCU YAF 1776. And with that, Ben Shapiro is editor-in-chief of the Daily Wire and host of The Ben Shapiro Show, the largest conservative podcast and radio show in the nation. Mr. Shapiro is a leading conservative speaker on college campuses, consistently defending free speech and open debate. Shapiro is the author of 8 books, including the #1 bestseller, the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. Shapiro has also been a nationally syndicated columnist since the age of 17 and is a graduate from UCLA and Harvard Law. The Washington Post calls him a foe of extraordinary polemical agility, and the New York Times calls him the cool kids philosopher. Right, yeah. Something we can actually agree with the New York Times on. Rush Limbaugh says Shapiro isn't just content to have people be dazzled by his brilliance. He actually goes out, confronts, and tries to persuade, mobilize, and motivate people. Glenn Beck calls Shapiro a warrior for conservatism against those who use fear and intimidation to stifle honest debate. I've never known him to back down from a fight. Everyone, please help me in giving a warm welcome to Ben Shapiro.
So much. Wow. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Love you too. No. Okay. First of all, let me start by saying thank you to everyone for coming out tonight and wasting your weeknight with me. I really appreciate it. Thanks to Fred Allen and Young America's Foundation. Thanks to GCU, YAF, for doing everything they've done to make sure that this could happen. Thank you to security for ensuring that we can have a great event tonight. And thanks to Grand Canyon University's administration for hosting me, eventually. So I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. I do have a couple of things to say on it. For people who are watching online and missed the hubbub, GCU was slated to host me a little bit earlier this year. At the beginning of February, the administration suddenly decided that they were not going to do so, and then they issued a statement claiming that while they believe, quote, in many of the things that Ben Shapiro speaks about and stands for, including his support for ideals that grow out of traditional Judeo-Christian values and his belief in a free market economy, they wanted to, quote, focus on opportunities that bring people together. As we can see tonight, those values and the core value of free speech and open discussion and debate bring a hell of a lot of people together in massive numbers. So, I have to tell you, I got legitimately hundreds of emails from people who are upset about GCU's decision. So thank you to all of those who made their voices heard to the administration here. Thank you to the administration for finally relenting. It was the right thing to do. And one final note on this subject before I actually move to the substance of the speech, with which I think the administration will generally agree. That is, that the original GCU administrative note stated they wanted to stop me from speaking in order to find, quote, a path toward unity. The administration said in their note that in banning me, they were attempting to, and I want to quote this, make peace in a way that honors Christ. The only path toward unity, as both the Old and, even in my passing familiarity with the New Testament, teaches, the only path toward unity is the path of truth. And that path can only be discovered by recognizing the inherent value in respectful, dignified examination of crucial issues. The only peace worth having is based on shared values that undergird our civilization, values worth defending. King David says in Psalm 34, turn from evil and do good, seek peace and pursue it. God says in Deuteronomy, tzedek tzedek tirdof, that's the Hebrew, righteousness, righteousness shall you pursue. There can be no peace without righteousness. And so we pursue righteousness because we love peace. We stand for values because we love peace. We seek unity in righteousness, not in platitudes, not in glossing over differences. As Psalm 85 says, I will listen to what God the Lord says. He promises peace to his people, his faithful servants, but let them not turn to folly. All right. Now to the actual substance of the speech. So right now, I think in Western civilization, we're having a crisis of meaning. And that's pretty obvious from a couple simple facts. We're the most prosperous, free society in the history of humanity. If you could pick any time to be born, you would pick right now, right here. There's no other time to pick. A baby born today can expect to live in excess of 80 years in incredible material prosperity that the richest people living in 1900 could never have considered. The average person in 1850s Europe died before the age of 40. In 1900, 1 in 10 children in the United States died before their first birthday. We now live in a country where infant mortality is unbelievably low, in a civilization where if you have a baby and the baby is born even remotely healthy, that baby will live for another 8 decades in health and prosperity. We live in a society where we have tremendous freedom to basically do what we want. A society where we get to choose how we live our lives. We get to bear the consequences of those choices. And in many cases, we don't even bear the consequences of those choices because the government is there to provide a social safety net. And yet, we seem unhappier than ever in many ways. The opioid epidemic is taking an increasing number of lives. Actual life expectancy in the United States has declined for the last couple of years, which is unheard of in a civilized society. It's been rising consistently year on year for decades. You can look at the rates of unhappiness in society. You can look at the rates of depression. You can look at drug use. You can look at the fact that, according to polls, our trust in key institutions has dramatically decreased. You can look at the fact that fewer and fewer of us trust our neighbors or even know our neighbors. It's not just economic divide. This is not a question of rich versus poor, because a lot of these problems seem to span economics. There are a lot of very unhappy rich people, a lot of very angry rich people, and you can feel it in the 2016 election particularly. This is when I started to feel it. It felt like there was something different happening. People were truly enraged at one another. Really enraged, looking at each other and saying, I can't be friends with you because we differ on policy. We see it in the preparation for the 2020 race, where the easiest way to run in 2020 is by castigating the motives of your opponent as somehow inferior or terrible. To take a quick example, when Mayor Pete Buttigieg over in South Bend, Indiana declared, I have to say that I was kind of attracted to his candidacy because he was the only person running who didn't seem like a crazy person. Right? Pete Buttigieg said, I disagree with the founders of Chick-fil-A on their politics, but they make a pretty good chicken sandwich. And that sounded pretty good to me. And then in the last couple of weeks, we have seen Mayor Buttigieg, who has never been mistreated by Vice President Mike Pence, not once in his life, talk about Mike Pence as though Mike Pence is out to get him. Suggest that Mike Pence is filled with animus and rage and anger, and that Mike Pence is trying to victimize him. There's no evidence of any of these things. In 2014, when Buttigieg, a member of the National Guard, was called into service, Mike Pence personally called him to thank him. In 2015, when Buttigieg came out of the closet, Mike Pence was asked about it. He said, I think Buttigieg is a good man. And now Buttigieg is going around bad-mouthing Pence, suggesting that he's a fanatic straight out of The Handmaid's Tale, and imputing to him an animus that Pence has never exhibited, suggesting that Pence is motivated by this evil hatred for gay people that Pence obviously does not have in his life. And it's easy to do that. We're doing this on all sides of the aisle, suggesting that people we disagree with simply on politics, that this is really about their underlying motives. They are bad people, and thus it's okay for us to be mean to them and be terrible to them. So what exactly has happened? I think what has happened is that there is a God-shaped hole in the American heart, and we are filling it with tribalism, and we are filling it with partisanship, and we are filling it with rage. And this is coming from somebody who spends his entire life in politics. And I'm not innocent in this, because anyone in politics is not. I've tried to do my best. I've tried to repent when I've done wrong. But I think that if you engage in the political sphere, it's hard not to get sucked into it. But the question is, do you try to do better? I do try to do better, I hope. But the bottom line is that it is easier to do better when you feel that there is a deeper thing that unites us as Americans and unites us as a civilization. And that unity feels like it's falling apart. It's why you hear increased talk of separation, like legitimately, people talking about the possibility of a separation between the states. Okay, this is now being discussed more commonly. The possibility of government completely falling apart. Why? Well, because our civilization has lost what it means to be happy. So we've substituted the idea of hedonism or temporary joy for happiness. So Western civilization was built on a certain perception of what happiness was, what made human beings happy, and what made a civilization happy. And it was built on two separate definitions that in the end are basically the same definition. One is the biblical definition of happiness. So in the Bible, it talks about simcha. And the Hebrew word simcha does not mean you like to go golfing sometimes. It means that it does not mean that you look at pornography and this gives you a temporary feeling of joy. Instead, what simcha was right action in accordance with God's will. Religion believes that if you are acting in accordance with God's will, this is what brings you happiness because this is what you were put on earth to do. It's a purpose-centered life, obviously. And if you look at Aristotelian thought, Greek thought, it was also driven by effectively the same argument, that true happiness, eudaimonia in Aristotle's phraseology, was a matter of being active in accord with complete virtue. And complete virtue was you using your reason to discover what your purpose was and then acting in accordance with that purpose. It was your use of reason to dominate your nature, to curb your nature and channel your nature towards something higher. We've forgotten about all of that because we've decided that other things were more important, and also because we've done away with the two poles of our civilization, Jerusalem and Athens. We've done away with Judeo-Christian values and Greek reason. Those were the forces, as I'll explain in a second, that undergirded the four elements that are necessary to making a civilization happy, to building a civilization capable of both simcha and eudaimonia. So what do we need to achieve happiness? We need four things. Pretty basic things. One, individual moral purpose. We each have to get up in the morning and feel like we have something to do. People who feel useless are depressed. People who feel like they don't have connections with others. People who feel like they don't have a mission in the world. These are people who lose meaning and they get depressed and they act out against others. You have to feel like you have a reason for being. You also have to feel like you have a capacity to act out to make that purpose happen. Like you are a powerful thing. You are not just a cork being bobbed about on the eddies of the world. Instead, you are a powerful individual with creative and reasoned capacity. You can make decisions, and those decisions have practical effects, practical ramifications, and good ramifications. And so you have to have individual moral purpose and individual capacity. You have to feel like you can do something. Free will. You're responsible for your actions. You also have to have communal moral purpose. You have to feel like you and your neighbors together have something in common. And that communal moral purpose is building a better community for yourselves, not through the mechanism of government, but because we love each other as brothers and sisters. Communal moral purpose was the idea of the social fabric. There's a social scientist named Robert Putnam, who works over at Harvard University, wrote a very good book called Building Alone, in which he coined the term social capital. And what he talks about in the book is he says that he used to be a big believer in the nostrum that is very often stated in politics, that diversity is our strength. He said, yeah, I really believe diversity is our strength. Then he did the research, and what he found is that ethnic diversity in a community predicted only two things. One, increased protest marches. Two, increased television watching. But that is not an argument against diversity itself. It's an argument against communities that don't have roots, because what he found is that diversity was indeed strength in places like churches. If you go to a church where everybody is worshiping in the same direction, where everybody has the same moral values, diversity is wonderful. You have a lot of people there of different ethnicities, different races, different backgrounds, people who bring their experiences to bear and can have conversations that broaden and deepen their commitment to this common purpose. And it's not just churches. He used the example of the Army. If you've ever, I'm sure most people in this room know folks who have served in the military. You talk to folks who serve in the military, it's a pretty diverse group of folks who serve in the military, and they all see each other as brothers and sisters. They all see each other as comrades because they have the same common purpose. You have to have a communal moral purpose because we exist not only as individuals, we exist as members of communities, and we want to be members of communities. Finally, we need communal capacity. So we have to feel like we have a system that allows us to act out in the world as individuals, as free, reasoning people, and also that can activate when necessary to get the big things done, to defend ourselves against foreign threat, to ensure that people who can't take care of themselves don't fall through the cracks. Right? These are the four things you need: individual moral purpose, individual capacity, communal moral purpose, and communal capacity. The civilization that has been best at filling these four silos has been the Judeo-Christian civilization of the West. Western civilization has been the best at doing this. This is why we have prosperity. It's why we have free markets. It's why we have democracy. For people who don't appreciate the civilization in which they live, they need to understand that Western civilization is the cause of all the good things they have in their life. There's Now, there's a basic disconnect right now in Western civilization about the nature of Western civilization. On one side, it's a little too broad to term it the right, but we will for purposes of this conversation. For one side, Western civilization is the font head. It's the place where we got all these great, eternal, wonderful values, and then we spread those values gradually to bigger and bigger groups of people. We haven't always lived up to the promise of those values, but that's what Western civilization is. Western civilization is a climb up a mountain, but the mountain itself is the principle. And so you look at the history of the United States and you see the great principles of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. You say these are good, and they weren't extended properly to black folks. They weren't extended properly to women. They weren't extended properly to Jews. They weren't extended properly to a wide variety of groups. And the story of America is how we took these amazing principles, this is the big bang of ideas, and we spread those out to encompass more and more people. So the story of Western civilization is a story of good, and a story of good that is constantly moving over obstacles. It's a story that spans from the Revolution to hundreds of thousands of Americans dying in a civil war to free black slaves, to civil rights marchers marching in the streets of Selma to ensure that black people have full rights. That's the story of Western civilization. Then there's the other side. The other side says Western civilization is bad. Western civilization has a lot of problems. Western civilization has been responsible for genocide. It's been responsible for slavery. It's been responsible for racism and xenophobia. It's been responsible for all these things. And all of these highfalutin principles you guys talk about, that's a bunch of nonsense because you didn't apply them to everybody, so they really didn't exist. They were just an excuse for you to feel good about yourself while you were engaging in a power hierarchy dominance. Because you were successful until you're basically stepping on other people and using free markets or free speech to do so. These principles didn't exist, it was just a mask for your power. That's not true, and the easy way to tell that that's not true is that all of the great evils that have existed in Western civilization have existed in virtually every other culture. All of the great goods of Western civilization have existed here and only here. All of the things that we enjoy, the prosperity, the technology, the democracy, all of that stuff happens in the West, and it happens for a reason. So now is the part where I explain what that reason is. So Jerusalem and Athens, we get some fundamental principles from Judeo-Christian values, and this is just historically accurate. Judeo-Christian values lie at the root of Western civilization. There's no other way to put it. Everybody who created Western civilization was a Christian. Everybody who created Western civilization was a Jew. Everybody who created Western civilization was a secular person who grew up in a Jewish or Christian society, a Judeo-Christian society. I had this conversation with Sam Harris, a militant atheist, and Sam and I were talking about why we shared the same values. And Sam said, well, you know, my values come from my wide reading in philosophy and my study of neurobiology and all of this. I said, right, but I didn't do any of that stuff, and I have the same values as you, so explain why our values match. And he said, okay, so what's your theory? I said, my theory is that we grew up 10 miles from each other in Los Angeles after 3,000 years of common Judeo-Christian heritage. That's my theory. So what exactly does Judeo-Christian heritage teach? Well, it teaches a couple things that you would have to assume that cannot actually be reasoned to. You can't logic your way to these fundamental principles. They have to be revealed to you. One, God is unified and a master plan stands behind everything. So we take that for granted, that the universe is an understandable place, and that the actions we take in the universe can make an impact in our lives, because the universe is not just a random bag of chaos. It's in that your life is not just a matter of you wake up in the morning and a bunch of gods are fighting over you, and then some like you and some don't, and they decide that they're going to tie your shoelaces together today. That's not what the universe is. The universe is instead a set of generally orderly rules. We can't always understand God's logic, but our minds reflect God's to the extent that we can at least suss out the basic notion that there is a logic to the universe, and we can see the hand of God in the events that happen in the universe. Paganism is largely about chaos and fate, and the idea of a unified God with a master plan standing behind everything, that is something that springs from a monotheistic God, a mind that stands behind universe. The second fundamental principle of Judeo-Christian morality is that human beings are held to morality not out of any subjective love for morality, but because there is such a thing as objective morality. There is a right and there is a wrong, and it is not subject to how you feel today. If you look at the value of sacrifices in the pagan world, to take an example, sacrifices in the pagan world were always about appeasing God. The God was ticked at you, and so you sacrificed a chicken, and then God was going to be happy with you, and now everything was going to be hunky-dory. Sacrifices in the Bible are meant to be a different thing, and people who don't actually study the Bible and don't spend a lot of time with the Old or the New Testaments don't understand that what the sacrifices were originally meant to be was not a way of bribing God. They were meant to be a moral reminder that all of your property is actually yours because God gave it to you, and thus you are recognizing the sovereignty of God through your sacrifices. That is not the same thing as God's ticked at me, so he's probably going to like this chicken. The third fundamental principle of Judeo-Christian values is that history progresses, that there's a progress to history. So many pagan religions believe that history is circular, it's cyclical, that it goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down, or that it's eternal and just kind of washes in and out. The Judeo-Christian heritage is a heritage that says slavery moves toward freedom, and human rights violations move toward human rights non-violation, and that paganism moves toward monotheism, and that you're instrumental in moving history forward, which means you have an obligation to help God out by doing what he wants you to do. And finally, Judeo-Christianity assumes that we have free choice. It assumes that we are responsible for the decisions that we make, and we have a duty to make correct decisions, as God says in Deuteronomy. I set before you today life and prosperity and death and destruction. Choose life so you and your children may live. If you don't believe in these fundamental principles, it's very difficult to build a civilization. Because if you don't believe that there is an orderly plan to the universe, it's hard to operate in that universe. If you don't believe that there's an objective morality, then why shouldn't I victimize somebody else who lives in the society with me? If I don't believe that history progresses, then what difference does it make what I do today? And if I don't believe that we have free choice, then I'm not even responsible for my own decisions. Okay, so that's one side of the coin. The other side of the coin is reason. Because if we just had the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's very easy to end up at theocracy, at forcing your religiously revealed views down on everybody else. You don't end up with religious diversity. You don't end up with the Judeo-Christian value system. You just end up with whatever is the specific doctrinal system that is being imposed from above. And that's a bad thing. It's a bad thing because you do need a variety of viewpoints within a common tradition in order to make that tradition better, as I said early on. Diversity of viewpoints is good so long as you have the same common goal. So you need reason on the other side. So Judeo-Christianity without reason ends up at theocracy. Reason, as we'll see, without Judeo-Christianity ends up in gulags and gas chambers. So the other side of the coin, though, is the use of reason, and this is where Greece comes in, the idea of Greek purpose and teleology, the idea that there is a purpose in nature, the idea of the natural law comes from the Greeks, that you can look at anything in the world and determine that it has a use, because there is a mind behind it. And this is why Aquinas is able to merge Aristotle with the Bible fairly easily, because he looks at the idea of the unmoved mover and he says, oh, well, obviously that's God, which is true. Aristotle felt the same way. There was an unmoved mover, and that unmoved mover had created purposes in nature, and we could discover the purposes in nature by looking at nature. So look at the evidence on the ground, and then you see that there is a purpose to this thing. And there is a purpose to a human being, and this is what gives you your purpose. What makes a human being different, what makes a human being good, is you fulfilling your fundamental purpose. The idea of the Aristotelian good is very different from how we think of good. We think of good as good and bad morally, making a moral decision. Aristotle thought of good somewhat like this. A good hammer is a hammer that is effective at hitting nails. A good spoon is a spoon that is effective at picking up soup. And a good person is a person who's effective at using that which distinguishes human beings from everything else, the ability to use reason. This is where reason becomes paramount in Western thought. And because of that, we have to study the universe around us, and that becomes the basis of science. We can actually look at the world around us, and we can make hypotheses about that world, and then we can look at the evidence and see if that matches up with the hypothesis to know the mind of the unmoved mover and to understand our own purpose better in the universe. We end up at a democracy because the state must be limited in order to forward the natural law. Anytime the state violates the natural law, then the state becomes no longer justified. This is the root of American revolutionary thinking. Right? It's easy to see the idea of a dominant state, an all-powerful dominant state that is the source of your rights. In fact, this is what much of the modern left thinks. You don't have rights that pre-exist government. Your rights come from government. That's not what the Greeks thought, at least that's not what Aristotle thought. He thought that you had natural rights that sprang from natural law. You look at the universe, and the universe says you have the capacity to reason. If a government violates your capacity to reason, it violates its own reason for being. A government that violates natural law has lost its reason for existence. Cicero and the Stoics bring this to fruition when they start talking about republicanism and the idea of a mixed system. You have a mixed system of aristocracy and democracy. Well, this tension is what built the United States, and you can see all of these strains come together in the American founding. The notion of all men having equal freedom and independence, that springs originally from the biblical notion of man being made in God's image, the single most important verse in the history of humanity. Human beings are made with actual, individual value, and you don't have to reason your way to it, because for most of human history we didn't. That is just a truth. It's a fundamental truth we all have to assume so we can get it from God. We are all important because we're made in the image of God. That is in the Declaration of Independence. The idea that liberty to exercise our will is necessary in government, that comes from a merger between Greek tradition and Judeo-Christian tradition. And freedom can only exist if we have a strong social fabric to back it up, if we have a strong moral and religious people. This was this was a universal view of the founders with the possible exception of Thomas Paine. Virtually every founder believed that you needed a moral and religious people if you were going to have freedom. The freedoms that we enjoy rest on the idea that we care for one another in our daily lives and that we are good to one another. Because if we do not act well to one another, then our freedom quickly deteriorates into libertinism and us victimizing one another. We need a moral and religious people, as John Adams said, or as Washington said, the foundation of our national policy will be laid in the pure and immutable principles of private morality, There exists in the economy and course of nature an indissoluble union between virtue and happiness. We focus a lot in the United States right now on rights, but the founders focused a lot in the early going on duties as well as rights. Every right came along with duties. Your right to free speech came along with a duty to use that free speech well, to study and speak well and converse with others. Your right to bear arms came along with a duty to use those arms to protect yourself, your family, and your country. Right? Rights were duties, and duties were rights. They were all the same side, two sides of the same coin. That's the merger. As I said before, if you get rid of either Jerusalem or Athens, all this falls apart. You get rid of Judeo-Christian morality, you end up with hedonism. You end up with people trying to reason their way to moral purpose. And that goes some really dark places. Because you can reason your way to a world where the individual no longer matters. After all, if you have to break a few eggs to make an omelet, you just go ahead and do so. This is how you end up at gulags. If you can build a better utopia by harming a few people, but it's better for most people, we'll go ahead and do it. There's no natural rights that necessarily spring from reason. The same thing is true when it comes to things like free speech. Why have free speech if you know you're right? Right? If reason dictates a particular outcome, then why should we have to have a conversation about it? You see shades of this when it comes to a lot of the calls for censorship today on a wide variety of topics online. We have to censor people. It's not because they're dangerous, but because they're wrong. That's dangerous stuff. Reason can lead you to a path where these rights no longer exist. And as I say, if you're just looking at biblical living, there's nothing in there that prevents a theocracy. You need these two things to be in tension. You need that balance. You need to apply reason to biblical revelation, but you need the basis of biblical revelation to provide the framework for reason itself. All of this is important to re-educate ourselves in. This is all basic to a lot of religious people or people who have studied philosophy. The fact is that if we don't re-educate ourselves in this, we lose all of it. Because we are an ungrateful people. We are an ungrateful people. It's hard not to be. You grow up in a country, particularly people my age and younger, I can still call myself young for the moment. We grow up in a society that is rich beyond all imagination with no existential foe to threaten us. We don't even remember the Soviet Union. The Berlin Wall fell when I was 7 years old. Okay, for many people in this room, the Berlin Wall fell before they were born. Okay, you don't remember the existential threat. You don't remember what it's like to look at other countries and think, we could be living like that. You think that the natural state of being is to live in prosperity, to live in freedom, to not be bothered by the government. You think that all of this is natural. It is absolutely the opposite of natural. It is the opposite of natural. What is natural to human beings is tribalism, us getting together in our own little racial groups and clubbing at each other. And you see a reversion to this in the intersectional theory of the left and in the white supremacy that you're seeing on the alt-right, both of which are absolutely morally reprehensible and disgusting, and a violation of fundamental principles of Western civilization. What's natural to human beings is self-interest and us going out and doing what we want at the expense of other people. That's not something that altruism is only natural for the in-group. It's not natural to everyone. Right? It's natural for you and your family. It's not natural to the guy who lives 10 miles away, necessarily. The fact is that you have to cultivate virtue. You have to cultivate an appreciation for your civilization. So here's what we need to understand. We need to understand that everything from the iPhone in our pocket to the planes we fly on to the freedoms that we experience are built on a 3,000-year history that took a long time to develop. And we are living at the leading tip of that spear. We are living at the top of this iceberg. And we can either carve away at the bottom of the iceberg and then hope this thing floats, or we can recognize that that iceberg needs to be constantly shored up. The foundations of the building need to be constantly shored up. We need to remind ourselves why the foundations are important. If we do that, then we can build minarets and towers that'll be greater than any that have yet to be built. Thanks so much. Happy to take your questions. Thank you. All right. Now for the fun part.
If you have a question for Mr. Shapiro, please form a line towards the back of the venue behind my colleague. If you come up to the front, you will be directed to the rear of the venue. Additionally, please limit to just one question. I will hold the microphone for you during your question, and please ensure that your question is a question. Furthermore, there will be no follow-up responses after you have asked your question. Thank you.
Oh yeah, and as always, I do have my one rule, which is that if you disagree on anything, it's not on the speech, just generally, you disagree with me on any topic, you go to the front of the line, because we like disagreements and discussions.
Do you believe that today's liberal views on finance by millennials and members of Generation Z are similar to those of the hippie movements in the 1960s and 70s?
On finance? Yes. Yeah, I mean, they're effectively similar. Yeah, I mean, I think that Bernie Sanders of 1970 looks like Bernie Sanders of 2019. He just has less hair, but.
Why do you think it is that, I love you, Ben. Listen to your podcast. Why do you think it is that so many colleges in this day is moving so far left when, like you were saying, the ideas that we have from Judeo-Christian values, they still stand true today? So why do you think it is that so many of these colleges and so many of students of our age are moving so far that way when we haven't even lived under a lot of the things they're trying to implement?
I think that there's something comfortable about believing. Here's the nice thing about being woke. Being woke means that people are going to basically leave you alone. There's a group of what I've termed woke scolds who make life miserable for everybody who dares to disagree with them. The easiest thing is just to say, fine, I have white privilege, and then move on with your life. And the squeakiest wheel gets the grease in this sense. The truth is the colleges have been very much to the left since the 1970s. They started moving really far to the left in the 1960s when the hippies took over the universities, and they've remained so ever since. There is also a self-enforcing echo chamber that exists at these universities, both procedurally and then socially. So procedurally, if you are applying for a dissertation with a leftist professor, the chances that you can write a right-wing dissertation, a conservative dissertation, are very low. And that's a problem because professors effectively create the next generation of professors, so it's hard to get past that. Beyond that, there's also an echo chamber that exists on campus where professors, like many in the media, seem to fall into this trap of thinking that because everybody immediately around them agrees with them, that means what they're saying is fact as opposed to opinion. And that's really incredibly dangerous. That echo chamber is extraordinarily powerful. And it does have an impact on how professors think and how they treat people who are outside that bubble. So it's a comfort level thing for a lot of students. A lot of students want to feel like, one, they're rebelling against their parents, or two, they want to be term tolerant. They're afraid of being called intolerant. They're afraid of being called bigots, because that's the worst thing you can call somebody in America today. And so they tend to cave to the social pressure that's on the student side. On the administrative side, there's that self-reinforcing echo chamber that's incredibly dangerous.
Hey Ben, big fan. Prior to my question, I want to establish some common ground between both of us. I think you and I, as well as most of us in this room, would agree that universal healthcare, especially run by government, would be a terrible idea. My question is in regards to free markets, particularly with how our healthcare system is now. I know you mentioned how it's kind of a hybrid between somewhat regulated, somewhat free market. Are there any regulations that exist currently that you would either propose that be lifted or completely removed to
Sure.
promote more of a free market system within our healthcare system?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so there are regulations that exist with regard to, for example, licensure. I think there are a lot of things that can be done by nurse practitioners that are done by doctors right now, and license requirements mean that you have an undersupply of healthcare in particularly emergency services areas that doesn't need to be the case. There are regulations on the books that prevent insurance companies from selling across state lines, as President Trump so notably pointed out during the debates. There are regulations on the books with regard to what sort of coverage can be provided by insurance companies. So insurance companies are not allowed to sort of provide whatever coverage they want. They have to provide a certain Chinese menu of services. And that's a problem because it doesn't actually provide a free market in healthcare. Also, you have these federal subsidies. The truth is that most of the spending on healthcare in the United States has something to do with both the state or the federal government. So our private healthcare system is largely funded by public dollars, but the vast majority of people who have a healthcare plan are doing so through their employer. Both of those things are a problem. I personally think that people should not get healthcare through their employer. People should be encouraged to get individualized plans. We'd all get paid more at work because the pay that we'd be getting at work is now going toward our healthcare. And then we would form social institutions. You'd go to your church, members of your church would get together, and they'd pay an insurance company to be a pooled insurance company. And that way you know that you're redistributing your healthcare dollar to the people in your community who are suffering from some sort of chronic difficulty. So there are all sorts of problems here. I don't think that additional regulation or nationalization is going to fix this problem, because what you really have is a mismatch between supply and demand in healthcare. And when Bernie Sanders says stuff like, okay, well, we're just going to Medicare for all, get rid of private insurance, and then it's only going to cost $32 trillion over the next 10 years. First of all, that's a doubling of the federal budget over the next 10 years. But second of all, that's a lowball estimate because that's assuming that Medicare is going to continue to pay at a 65 or 70% reimbursement rate. You think doctors are going to work for 60% reimbursement rates? The only reason they take Medicare in the first place, I know there are doctors in this room shaking their head right now. The fact is that the only reason that doctors work for a 60% reimbursement rate for Medicare is because they are supplementing that with all of the private insurance plans from which they're getting higher reimbursement rates. Doctors right now are moving out of primary care specifically because they don't want to work with the government. They don't want to work with Medicare or Medicaid. So, you know, a more competitive healthcare system, I think, would work better. And then we have to fill in the gaps left for people who don't have health insurance and have chronic conditions, they have pre-existing conditions, or people who can't pay for it themselves. Then you try and find ways to backfill that. But to blow up in the entire system when legitimately 93% of Americans have a health insurance system of some sort or another is almost insane. It's almost insane. It also misses the upside of the American healthcare system. You get stuff when you want it. Okay, hundreds of people in Britain are going blind every year from waiting for the surgeries that they need in line. In Canada, elective surgeries like hip surgeries, you're waiting months to do this sort of stuff. That's why people are trying to buy private insurance in places like Ontario. What you actually require is, as you say, deregulation and treating healthcare like a market. Because anytime you treat anything like a market, you create more of it, you create more competitiveness in that market, and then there are certain people who have no choice but to engage in higher levels of the market, and there we try to figure out whether community can provide some sort of support basis for them.
Hi, Ben. My question is that in the 21st century, Amazon has monopoly and social media sites, Facebook and Twitter, have monopolized the scene. Should the government step in and break these monopolies and trusts to promote competition and promote free speech and restrict private censorship? Or should they not get involved in this and leave the market alone?
So I am anti-antitrust. So I think that the government far too often gets involved in antitrust from the wrong angle. So there are a couple of different perspectives on antitrust. Antitrust is breaking up monopolies. So one perspective is that if a company gets too big, then we will now consider it a monopoly. The other way to look at a monopoly is does it harm consumers? So I'm on the does it harm consumers side, meaning are they jacking up prices? Are they price gouging, for example? And mostly, are they able to do this because they have engaged in a form of regulatory capture where they are working with the government to shut other people out of particular industries? That's usually how most actual monopolies exist, is the government gives a license to one company and no one else can enter into that space. It's hard for me to say that Google or Facebook or Twitter are monopolies when they didn't exist 15 years ago, and I don't know if they'll exist 10 years from now. I don't know if you'd want to buy Facebook stock given the way things are going for Facebook right now, really. And that's a problem. As far as breaking up Amazon, I don't see any problem with what Amazon is doing. You get cheaper products. Everybody is using Amazon as a distributor. Those products compete with Amazon distribution systems. So, and the government is not guaranteeing, far from it, Amazon's monopoly power. So I don't really see why that's a monopoly. As far as Facebook and Google, the problem there is not that they are a quote-unquote monopoly. The big problem there, because I'm old enough to remember, you don't remember, but I'm old enough to remember when Ask Jeeves, Alta Vista, and Yahoo were things. But the big problem with Google and Facebook and Twitter, and I'm in the tech space, right? We run Daily Wire, and we're constantly having to worry about whether Facebook is going to downgrade us or Twitter is going to ban me or something. And what that means is that those sites are actually not platforms, those sites are actually editorial sites. And that means that they should legally be treated as editorial sites the same way my site, Daily Wire, is treated as an editorial site. If we print something libelous, we get sued. If Facebook has somebody post something libelous, Facebook does not get sued. Why? Because Facebook's contention is that they're basically a phone line. If you get on the phone to your mom tonight and you say something libelous, AT&T doesn't get sued. They say they're like AT&T. The problem is, what if the phone line were to start beeping out every time they thought something was a problem? Well, now they're the editor. Now they're responsible for what's on the line. That's what Facebook is doing. So if Facebook is going to engage like an editorial company, they should be treated like an editorial company, and that means making them responsible for the content that appears on their platforms. Sorry, I can listen well. I'm signing.
So thanks for coming first, Ben. Socialism is all the rage nowadays, right? And you frequently talk about capitalism on your show and the merits of capitalism and the good things. I want to be able to defend capitalism on a bit of a deeper level. So what do you think are the most coherent arguments against capitalism Or what do you think are some real built-in flaws, and then what would be your rebuttal or your solution?
So the only built-in flaw in capitalism is that you are responsible for your own actions, and there are people who legitimately can't be held responsible for their own actions. So really, I mean, there are people who are sick, there are people who have mental issues, and so what you'll see is people on the left point to those people and say, well, what does capitalism do about them? And the answer is capitalism doesn't do anything about them. That's where your church comes in. What capitalism does for those people is it makes sure that when they actually get a check from somebody giving charity, that they can actually spend it on something. Because the fact is what capitalism does on an effectiveness level is it makes products better, it makes them cheaper, and it makes them more plentifully available. But there's something deeper to capitalism. And this is a pet peeve that I have right now in this moment in time with both right and left. There's this populist movement ranging from the Bernie Sanders left to the Tucker Carlson right that says, why can't we make markets work for us? Why can't we make markets are just a system after all. Why can't we make markets work for human beings? Markets are not a system. Markets are a recognition that you are in charge of your own labor. Markets are a recognition of your individual value. Markets are not a system because you didn't create markets and neither did anybody else. There was no one at the top deciding what a market constitutes. Unlike every other form of economic redistributionism and regulation in human history, when it comes to markets, there are no overarching rules. The only rule is you can't punch somebody else in the face and take their stuff. That's the only rule. Otherwise, you own your own labor and you get to freely alienate that labor. That is a wonderful thing. That's an amazing thing. For the vast majority of human history, you couldn't do that. Somebody else owned your labor. You were born into servitude. It was awful. Now, you know that you own your labor, and I can trade my labor for your labor. I can trade my stuff for your stuff. I can do whatever I want in the economic sphere. In order to really enjoy the market, you have to embrace two things. You have to embrace, first of all, your understanding that other human beings' labor is not yours. You are not owed their labor. Okay? That is thievery. As I've said many times, I think that the very idea of Marxism is a violation of at least 3 of the 10 commandments. It's a violation of thou shalt not steal. It's a violation of thou shalt worship God and have no idols, because government is not supposed to be your God. And it's a violation of the 10th commandment that you're not supposed to covet your neighbor's ass. CC Bill Clinton. So But the other thing that it's necessary to believe, and this is why I put such emphasis on free will and making choices and being responsible for those choices, is that you are owed nothing. You are owed nothing. And people think this is a drawback. Socialism, in my view, is immoral because it says, I'm breathing, give me stuff. And capitalism is moral because it says, I'm breathing, therefore I need to go out and do something that will be of benefit to somebody else. Because if I go out and I do something that I like to do, but it's of no benefit to anybody else, I don't make any money. I can't trade my labor for somebody else's labor. I don't get to decide what's valuable. That is decided by other people. I've described capitalism as forced altruism, which I think is effectively true from an efficiency perspective. That's a very, very good thing. In order to embrace that, you have to embrace the spirit of adventure. You are owed nothing. The only thing you are owed is the adventure. And the adventure is fantastic. It's great. It's what makes you a human being. It's what makes you a valuable human being. You go out and you forge forth, and sometimes you leave the land that your parents grew up in, and you go to a place that you know not, right? This is what you do. And one of the things that's sad about where we stand in modern day America is that it is easier to travel than ever before, but the rates of people leaving their home state to go find a job somewhere else is the lowest that it's been in decades. That, to me, is a sign of a spiritual malaise, to quote Jimmy Carter. And I think that, which I will never do again. And I think, but that spirit of adventure is what makes a man a man. It's what makes a woman a woman. It's what makes a child an adult. It's what gives you a sense of mission and purpose in the world. And if you can embrace that spirit of adventure, that's what made America America. I'm so confused by people who say, well, you know, I live in America, therefore I should get to grow up in the town that I want, never have to leave this town. How do you think this town got here? Right, we're in Arizona. It turns out that when people got to the United States, Arizona was super far away.
Hey Ben, my name's CJ. I disagree with you on just about everything.
Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.
No
Really.
problem, my friend.
Really.
Shalom. So my question is, you noted that Western civilization was built upon Judaism or Judeo-Christian values. But would you concede that other civilizations, such as the Islamic civilization, especially during its golden age, and Chinese civilization and Indian civilization, which were very economically successful as late as the 17th and 18th century, would you concede that their failure ultimately stems from Western imperialism and the exploitation of these regions, which were successful prior to the West conquering and then exploiting them for their raw materials?
No. So, no, historically, I would not concede that. So the Islamic world didn't fail because the West was involved with the Islamic world. The Islamic world failed because it fell into fundamentalism. Between 800 and 1400, as you know, the Islamic world was responsible for the preservation of a lot of the Greek literature that I'm very fond of. It was intellectually thriving. There was economic growth. It was an attempt to balance fundamental principles and reason. And then Islam fell into a form of fundamentalism that tried to rule out reason in favor of theocracy, and that has continued, unfortunately, until today. As far as the failure of economic growth in places like China, China was successful as a mercantilist state in the same way that some Western countries were successful as mercantilist states. But what has made the world different is not mercantilist states. What has made the world different is a fundamental recognition of the alienability of individual human labor, and that is what has allowed the West to grow beyond China. So China is still a very powerful country, economically speaking, but it has not embraced the principle of individual human liberty still, and that's a serious problem. So I don't think that imperialism can really explain the failures of other civilizations to grow beyond a certain point or stagnation at a certain point. I think that's putting a little bit too much, historically speaking, not enough on the civilizations themselves, and too much on military conquest how long did the military conquest of China last? China was in control of its own fate before and after. So the conquest of China, including of Hong Kong, lasted, approximately 100 years? 130 years?
Mainland China, roughly up until 1949, when the Maoists took over Hong Kong
Right.
until like 1997.
And by the way, Hong Kong was the most successful economic area of China. Right, which is so if we're talking about economic stagnation, Hong Kong's actually a terrible example. It's a great example of how adopting Western values in cultures that were not originally Western has led to massive economic growth. It's also true of free markets in Singapore and in South Korea and in every other place that has adopted Western values with regard to free markets and property ownership. So the conquest of those areas may be unjustifiable on an imperialist level, but from an economic growth standpoint, it was very good for Hong Kong that Hong Kong was conquered by the West, just in pure GDP growth terms. As far as the conquest of China, you're right. From the Opium Wars, which began, the 1850s, until about 1949, so about a 100-year gap right there. That is not what leads China to be a laggard in terms of economic growth. It certainly is not what leads China to be a laggard in terms of human freedom. There was a great lack of human freedom in China far beyond the West in leading up to Western imperialism and then following Western imperialism. So the question is, the expansion of Western values, are those good for countries or bad for countries? That's not a justification of imperialism, which can, in fact, lead to the subjugation of peoples, obviously. But I'm loath to blame every problem in every part of the developing world on Western imperialism when I don't think the record quite bears that out. Is that fair?
Hey, Ben. Big fan. I really appreciate everything you've been doing, pioneering. I heard a rumor a few months back, and I wanted to ask directly to the source. In 2024, will you be running for president?
Oh, man. It seems like a terrible job. First of all, the campaigning, I have little kids. I have a kid that's 5 and a kid that's 2, and I'm hoping to have more. And I know, they're really cute. Yay, children. But all the traveling looks terrible. I'm friends with several senators, and honestly, their life does not seem all that great. Because here's how it works. You travel around a lot, leaving your family behind for most of the week. You go back for the weekend, you hang out a little bit, and then when you finally win, you get to go to Washington, D.C. and hang out with the least likable people on planet Earth. Also, let's put it this way. I could see circumstances in which I thought the country was in such grave position and where I didn't think that there was anybody else capable of stepping up, where I would do something like that. But I don't see that situation as eventuating itself anytime soon. I mean, I think there are a number of good younger conservatives who are in the woodwork. You know, I've spoken to many of them. I think Greg Abbott of Texas is fantastic. I think that Governor Ducey here is very good. I think that Nikki Haley obviously comes from. I'm a big Nikki Haley fan.
Hello, Mr. Shapiro. It's an honor to speak with you tonight. I seem to have a strong disagreement with you in regards to the Second Amendment. So I've heard you describe yourself as a textualist when it comes to your interpretation of the Constitution. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. So then in October of 2017, you tweeted out, bump stocks should be illegal, but we shouldn't pretend that outlawing them will prevent their easy manufacture and availability. My question is, why would you support the banning of bump stocks when we know that the intentions of the Second Amendment were to fight off against the federal government?
Okay, so the balance of the Second Amendment, this is a good question. The balance of the Second Amendment is, in my view, in the view of Justice Scalia, that pretty much no one believes that you should be able to own a nuclear weapon. Right? That if so there's an argument that, so the question is, how do you balance the capacity to fight off an invading force with the inherent dangerousness of particular types of weaponry? And certain weapons are more dangerous than other weapons, obviously a nuclear weapon being the ultimate example, or the ownership of tanks, broadly speaking, across the United States would probably, LA would be a problem. Where I come from, I don't know how it is out here in Arizona. In LA, it's real weird. But it would be weirder with tanks. With that said, the case that I was making with regard to bump stocks is that even the NRA has come out against the widespread availability of fully automatic machine guns. And they've been basically illegal in the United States since the 1934 National Firearms Act. And so the use of at least for sale, you're allowed to buy old ones. There's some that are grandfathered in, but fully automatic machine guns are not broadly available for sale in the United States. That's been true federally for 80 years. So with that said, the bump stocks that kind of transform or are supposed to transform a semi-automatic weapon into a weapon that fires like an automatic weapon falls to me under the same general rubric. So this one falls under, I understand the theoretical want to get rid of a bump stock, but as I say in that tweet, I support the idea of a bump stock ban, but I don't think it necessarily is going to do anything. I just think that you can bump fire a gun without having a bump stock. You can manufacture a bump stock in your garage using a spring and a piece of plastic. So I'm skeptical that it actually achieves the effect that people want it to achieve, but the logic behind it, which is that fully automatic machine guns ought to be not widely available, I think is effectively correct.
So, sort of a two-parter, gigantic fan. Could I please get a selfie after this? And then part two, I ran into someone that came into my place of work. It was an individual that said, "Stop the U.S. invasion of Venezuela." I was like, "What do you mean?" He said, now this was his words, "The protests and riots were because of the U.S. invasion, and the people of Venezuela have, every year their quality of living has improved under Maduro." How do you talk to someone like that, or is it just easier to save yourself the frustration?
Well, I mean, it's not even saving yourself the frustration. At that point, you back slowly into the bushes like Homer Simpson. I do have a basic rule of thumb, which is don't talk to crazy people. And that person is, that's crazy. I mean, there's nothing there that is even remotely close to true, so there's no way to argue with that other than to, make the sign of the cross and hope he's not a vampire. There's nothing there. I've got no response to that one. I'm sorry.
Hello, Ben. Very nice to meet you. I do agree with you on all your beliefs except one, and that's the case on abortion. You did note that you believe that you have stated that they should be called baby killers. What can you say to that? Because two of my friends were unfortunately victims of sexual assault, and they did carry kids to the full term. What would you say to them if they were speaking with you?
And they did carry the kids, or they did not?
They did, but they did have very long thoughts about
So,
ending the pregnancy.
so a couple of things. I mean, the first thing I would say to them is these are some of the greatest heroes in our society. That is an act, as much as I believe in the principles of what I'm saying, I can still recognize bravery in doing the right thing in a very difficult emotional situation, and that is an act of an almost unthinkable moral bravery. To be victimized by somebody and then carry the child to term and have the baby and give it a home is an act of such heroism, it almost makes me want to weep how heroic that is. It's incredible. As far as the labeling of people baby killers, I would never say that a woman who participates in an abortion is a baby killer. I don't think anybody who's pro-life would. I think that most people would say that the woman is a victim of the abortion just as the child is a victim of the abortion, because if the woman actually believed she were killing her own baby, she wouldn't do it. We have a society that has convinced women that what they are killing is not actually a child, what they are killing is a cluster of cells, which is untrue. I would suggest, however, that doctors who perform late-term abortions are in fact baby killers. If you are a doctor and you're performing an abortion at 20 weeks,
Mr. Shapiro, it is an honor to be here. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. On January 8th, 2012, you tweeted that Fantasia on a Theme is your favorite piece of music. And I love the classics, I love your violin pieces, but my question is, do you have a favorite Taylor Swift song?
sick son of a... Now we've got bad blood. I know, it used to be Mad Love. Look what he's done.
Geez, now my question is going to sound all boring now. But all right, one of my favorite Sunday specials that you've done on your show is actually with John MacArthur. He's actually one of my favorite preachers. And I was actually wondering if, what exactly did you think about that entire interview? And was there any sort of ideas that John MacArthur put forward that you didn't think of previously?
So, I typically don't get into New Testament versus Old Testament theological discussions. And the Sunday Special is a place where I like to give guests sort of the full capacity to explain their position on a wide variety of issues. So I didn't want to turn it into a debate over sort of Hebraic readings of Old Testament texts versus New Testament readings of Old Testament texts. So I didn't get into that. What I like about MacArthur is that he does take biblical text incredibly seriously, and that he does predicate his readings on the text itself. He's obviously a scholar of the text, which is something as somebody who reads in the original Hebrew, I'm very fond of that. So that I thought was great. I found it, some of his takes I found very interesting. I mean, and I disagree with on a real basic level. He made a statement, for example, that it is not up to human beings to rebel against their governments, for example. So he said that he has objections to the American Revolution. Obviously, I disagree with that. Or he has said the same thing with regard to even when your government is evil, do you have to obey the government because that is one of the dictates as he reads it. I disagree with him on that, but I find it interesting. I also find interesting just the way that he approaches the conversation, which is using the Bible as sort of the forward edge of how he talks, which is kind of it's kind of the reverse of what I do. So I wear a yarmulke. I obviously take the Bible very seriously. It's why I take off from Friday night to Saturday night. It's why I keep kosher and make my security detail extraordinarily annoyed that we have to find kosher restaurants every time I go out on the road. But with that said, whenever I make an argument, I make a secular-based argument because I can't assume that the person I'm talking to believes in the Bible. So me arguing based on a verse from a Bible, I might as well be quoting for these people a sentence from Dr. Seuss for some of these folks. So it doesn't wash for them. But MacArthur makes a different case, which is if you believe that morality springs from the Bible, that's the only place that you can quote from. So obviously you should start by leading with that. And then if people have questions about it or they don't like it, well, then you hit them with, okay, here's why you should believe in the Bible. It's an interesting angle. It's one I think that is more appropriate for him doing what he does. I think my angle is better for what I do, but it's something I respect for sure.
Hi, big fan. A leftist friend and I once got into a debate about whether or not white males' opinions should carry weight in discussions concerning the LGBT community, feminism, and race. And she argued that white males' words should not carry the same weight as marginalized groups that they themselves do not belong to. And I argued with her a lot. And she said, to say that they can have equal voice in discussions involving oppressed groups that they don't belong to is inherently wrong. And that even though they're an ally, the best thing that they can do is listen. And I was wondering how you would go about debating such an opinion, and if white people are really immune to racism, and if they are allowed a voice in political topics.
That argument, which lies at the root of the intersectional argument, is nothing but sheer bigotry. It is sheer basic bigotry that undermines the most crucial element of a free republic. A republic is based on the idea that you and I can have a conversation, that my membership in an identity group does not obviate my need to make an argument to you or my necessity for listening to an argument from you. And this, again, I think springs from the notion that we are all made in God's image, and God doesn't really care whether we are black, white, or green. He doesn't really care whether I'm Jewish or Christian when it comes to the crucial issue of whether your opinion ought to have weight in a logical conversation. God's a fan of logic, in other words. And I think that we all should be fans of logic if we hope to live in a republic together. There's nothing I despise more than the notion that I am supposed to shut up because your truth trumps the truth. There's no such thing as your truth, there is just the truth. There's your experience, and there's your experience, and we should listen to your experience, and then we should also listen to data, and we should listen to other evidence. Your experience is not where the world began spinning. The world was here before you were born, and it'll be here long after you're gone. You are not that important in the world, and neither is your group identity, frankly. In fact, it runs contrary to every element of good faith conversation to suggest that you have to sit down and shut up because of your color. And if we reversed the colors, everybody would understand how racist and horrible this is.
Hi. So my question is, every day it seems as though our government is attempting to take away our constitutional rights. And I'm just wondering from my perspective on how you would advise me to protect those rights. I've never really participated in government in any shape or form, and I'm afraid that we're heading down the path of Nazi Germany.
So I'm always hesitant to liken a free republic like ours to Nazi Germany. I don't like Hitler comparisons. I don't like Nazi Germany comparisons, mainly because they're immediately linked to the Holocaust. Just there's no way to de-link them. I don't think we're around the corner from the Holocaust here. I don't think we're close to it, thank God. As an Orthodox Jew who runs around the country in my yarmulke, I'm not going to pretend that this is 1933 Germany. Let's put that to the side. Am I worried about oppression from the government? Yeah, I'm worried about oppression from the government, of course. I live in California. I'm profoundly concerned that the California government is going to use particularly anti-discrimination law as a club to wield against religious people. I'm afraid they're going to shut down religious schools. I'm afraid they're going to shut down religious institutions. I'm afraid that we're getting to the point that, like Bill C-16 in Ontario, there's going to be a move to take children out of homes if they are not indoctrinated in the social left values that the left wishes to purvey. I'm scared of all of those things. That's why I think that fighting on a public policy level is necessary to protect ourselves. And that's why I think the argument to the left should be, listen, you need to leave me the hell alone. It's why I'm libertarian when it comes to government more than anything else, because here's my inherent bargain with you. I will leave you alone. I have my views about what it is that you do in your life. And you don't have to care about those views. You know why you don't have to care about those views? Because I'm not imposing those views on you from above. In return, you should not impose your views on me from above, because I don't owe you anything. You don't owe me anything. The only thing that we owe to each other is recognition that we're allowed to differ on issues where I'm not forcing you to do anything. And if we can't have that discussion, then you're a tyrant. If it turns into, if you're going to point the government gun at me because we disagree, this makes you a tyrant. So do we have to get involved in governmental issues? Yes. And I'm fearful that everyone who's religious in California is going to have to leave, that there will be a time in the next 5 to 10 years where you're going to see a mass exodus of religious people from the state of California who want to live out their faith, and they'll come to Arizona, they'll come to Texas, they'll move out. It's an increasing polarization in the country. It's really, really ugly. It's really ugly, because this is all so easy. Just leave each other alone. I feel like in politics, half the time I'm just doing what I'm doing with my 5-year-old and my 2-year-old. Right? Where they're just slapping at each other, and I grab one by one arm and one by the other arm and just leave each other alone. For the love of God, just stop this.
Thank you very much for coming, Ben. I had zero disagreements with you until tonight, unfortunately. But
Wow.
This is a good one. Yeah. First of all, though, real quick, I was the fortunate student that when you were originally blocked, I started organizing a protest, and I was wondering if you'd sign this flyer that I had.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's fine, that's fine. So my disagreement comes, I do agree, we need faith and reason, of course, very useful things, but it seems that, I would guess maybe I was misinterpreting, but it seems that you think we're in a decline of reason and it's going to be the downfall possibly of the American Western society. I would say that I've seen in history we've had different periods of romanticism, transcendentalism, possibly the Renaissance, the hippie movement in the 1960s, also paralleled by other movements of the founding of the United States, other great periods of time of the Age of Reason and things like that. So I would argue that maybe in 20 to 50 years, the United States will become on an incline of Age of Reason again, and we'll be fine. And that we're not going to parallel or dive deep down into the depths of nothingness and things like that. Would you agree or disagree? Did I misinterpret you?
No, so I think that it's possible. Maybe you're right. One of the reasons I'm pessimistic is because all of the ages that you mentioned did still have a Judeo-Christian underpinning to which we return. Because one of the arguments that I make is that the notion of reason itself is rooted in certain assumptions about humanity and our purpose. Let's take the secular materialist view for a second, the scientific materialist view, which I oppose my view to, I think, in a dichotomous fashion. The scientific materialist view argues that we're basically balls of meat wandering through space. We don't have will. We are a series of biologically adaptive neurons that evolve over time to ensure the spread of our species. And that means that reason itself is not particularly important to that mathematics. It's only important so long as it's evolutionarily beneficial, but there's no moral component to reason. There's nothing that makes reason moral. The only thing that makes reason moral, presumably, would be the greater spread of the species. But even that can be achieved through force, most obviously. So you need the assumption that human beings are more than a ball of meat wandering through space in order to believe that reason is important. The value of reason, in other words, is a moral viewpoint. Saying that reason is important is a moral viewpoint. And I think that we are now moving beyond that, and that's what scares me. When I see people who are saying reason itself is a disaster area. So I think that there are some elements to the romantic and transcendental movements of the 19th century that were an attempt to revert to religion. They were saying there are limits to reason. They were saying not that reason is totally wrong, but that people who are attempting to create these cloud castles based on reason alone are bound to fail because there's more to the human being than just sitting in a room and mathematicking things out. So that I think there was truth to that. I think that was an attempt to rise to a spiritual call. But what I'm seeing right now is not an attempt to rise to a spiritual call. It's an attempt to sink to a spiritual depth. It's an attempt to sink into feelings and subjectivism and emotion and my truth. And all that matters is what I feel today, not even what I think and what I've logicked out, what I feel today. That's why I think that the gender versus sex issue is a really good case in point of this. Sex exists. Men are men. Women are women. Trying to pretend a man can become a woman or a woman can become a man in fully anti-scientific fashion because it makes people feel bad to say otherwise is just emotion over reason. I'm scared of that, and I'm seeing a rise in that. I think the reversion to tribalism is reason being put to the side, shunted aside, in favor of tribal affinity, which is an emotional response, a natural but paganistic emotional response. That's what I'm afraid of. So the argument that I would make is that in the past, when all of these emotional movements came to the fore, there was still a religious undergirding that allowed us to return to reason, and there was a vacillation between emotion and reason, but you still had this other pole of the bridge. So my metaphor is that civilization is built on this bridge. Here's Jerusalem, here's Athens. And if Athens starts to waver, Jerusalem's still here. So the bridge is wobbly, but Jerusalem is still here. Well, what happens when both of them just disappear? And that's what I'm worried about right now. Jerusalem disappears, and then reason starts to gradually move toward the waterline. There's nothing left to hold it up on the other side. So listen, I pray that you're right. I hope and I pray that you're right. I hope that we're part of the movement that reinvigorates the need for reason.
Hello, Ben. Thank you for coming. I've been a big fan for a long time. What would you say to those in the Middle East and elsewhere who might hate Western values because of the interventions that have been done by America and other Western nations?
Well, first of all, I think that to pretend that clash of civilizations would not exist in the absence of Western intervention is to be historically ignorant. And the Crusades were a response to Muslim imperialism in the West, not the other way around, just historically speaking. All of those areas were Christian before they were Muslim. So what drove Muslim armies to run roughshod across those areas in contravention of Christian rights at the time? Now, that's not to pretend that Christian rights at the time were treating Muslims any better, because they weren't. But to pretend that these conflicts only arise because of America, what I fail to understand is there are several of these countries that America has intervened on behalf of. And that has not seemed to alleviate the suggestion that America is a terrible place. So America has intervened on behalf of Saudi Arabia to protect it from the predations of Saddam Hussein. And that was used as an excuse by Osama bin Laden to attack the United States on 9/11 at the USS Cole. The United States intervened on behalf of Muslims in Yugoslavia. The United States has intervened on behalf of Syrian Muslims. The United States has intervened on behalf of Iraqi Muslims. The United States has intervened in a wide variety of places on behalf of Muslims. And that has not seemed to change the logic for a lot of people. I don't think that it's really about that. I think that it has almost nothing to do with that. I mean, I think that the hatred for the West in certain parts of the Middle East is because of a fundamentalist interpretation of Islam that is held by some but not all. And that is mirrored in a belief system about how their own governments should work, the imposition of criminal Sharia law from above, the belief that honor killings are okay in certain parts of the world. And these barbarities that are perpetuated on mostly Muslims has nothing to do with the West. And I think that that has much more to do with the clash of cultures than it has to do with the United States invaded Iraq in 2003 or the United States invaded Afghanistan in 2002 or 2001. So I don't buy it.
Hello, Ben. I'm a big fan, which is why I printed your face on my t-shirt. But I do have a quick question / clarification about something that was said earlier about abortion.
Mm-hmm.
You said that you would not refer to women who have abortions as baby killers because they don't believe that what they have inside of them is a baby.
Yes.
So is the argument that ignorance has some sort of effect of absolving someone of moral responsibility for their actions? And if so, would you apply the same thing to someone who does not believe that African Americans have human value and therefore enslave them or some sort of situation like that?
So I think that I want to think it through. So when it comes to abortion, the argument holds, meaning there's not proper mens rea. I think that the argument that black people were not human beings is a lot harder to sustain than the argument that let's put it this way. There is a point where ignorance obviously shades over into deliberateness, where ignorance is no longer an excuse. You got a black person in front of you, say that black person is not a black person. I think that it's going to be very hard to sustain that. But I will say that in the United States, people who held slaves were pardoned by the United States government in the aftermath of the Civil War. So there is, as we gradually move forward toward a better understanding of our own values and toward a fulfillment of our own values, yes, ignorance is sometimes an excuse. The question is an excuse in a given time and place? So right now, if a person said a black person is not a black person, so I'm enslaving them, we would all go, that's insane. If people said that in 1810, it was not societally insane. Now, from our view now, it was insane. And on an objective level, I think that it's insane, and I hope that I would have believed the same thing in 1810. But I think that we have this very bizarre view of history where we can inject the fact that we have developed 200 years beyond 1810, and then say, well, I would have been the perfect citizen back in 1810. I would have stood up and done the right. I think that's a real high view we have of ourselves. And so I hesitate to put myself in the position of women who have been indoctrinated by a media and government propaganda machine that has suggested that babies are not babies for decades at this point.
Hey, Mr. Shapiro, it's literally a check off my bucket list to see you speak in person. So from the bottom of my heart, thank you for coming.
Well, thank you. And I hope you get a better bucket list.
Well, seeing Michael Bublé was another thing on my bucket list, and I did that 2 weekends ago. So since winter is coming this weekend, and I know you're a big Game of Thrones fan, who do you think is going to be sitting on the Iron Throne at the end of the season, or if there's going to be an Iron Throne at all to sit on?
Yeah, so I have a seeping dread about where this season is going to go. I was really not pleased with the last season when they discovered the magic time traveling machine and people were jet setting all over Westeros. It was taking them weeks to go from one area of Westeros to another area of Westeros for 6 seasons, and then suddenly they discovered airplanes or something, and people were and suddenly Gendry was an Olympic runner moving from the north back down south of the wall, and he was doing like a day. Like, wait, it took you like a week to get out here. How'd you do that, man? He's like, I'm a great runner. Like, okay, and so I have some problems with that. I also I have to say that the part of the show that I really loved at the beginning was twofold. One, that it was a subversion of all the genre doctrines. So anybody could die at any time, including the good people, which I think is more of a reflection of human life than typical storytelling. And also I love the politics is the stuff that I liked about the show. The magic was much less interesting to me. So the dragons and all of that, I can see that in virtually any sci-fi thing. I think they've moved away from a lot of the politicking. They killed off every clever character, every single one. They're all dead. I liked all the clever characters. Like Tywin, I was a big Tywin fan. I wasn't a huge Littlefinger fan, but at least he was trying to be smart. I keep hearing that Tyrion, for some reason, this is going on too long. I keep hearing that Tyrion, for some reason, is smart, but he hasn't given a good piece of advice in 5 or 6 seasons. He keeps saying that he's wise and he drinks wine. I'm only seeing the drinking. Where do I think this ends up? I think, unfortunately, this ends up with Dany going crazy because she has to, right? Because of the Mad King. Her going crazy, Jon having to put her down. Because Jon has to put her down, he then has to recede into the west. He's already died. He can't be the guy who sits on the Iron Throne. They end up smelting the Iron Throne, and you end up with a council led by Tyrion and Sansa and the survivors, which would just be terrible. That would just be terrible. Stannis forever, man.
Hi.
Hi.
First, can you sign this for me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then politically, I agree with you on everything, but religiously, I'm a Christian, so I was just wondering why you don't think Jesus is the Messiah.
So right, good question. It's fine. It's fine. No, it's fine. So as I always do on this answer, let me preface this with the reason I generally don't have these theological discussions is mainly because, in the words of a famous person, I find it divisive. CC, GCU. But the reason normally I don't have those discussions is because I feel that the values that undergird Judeo-Christianity we hold much more in common than we have apart. So assuming all of that, the doctrinal reason that Jews don't believe in Jesus, and I'm not the only one, right? It was so funny. There was some kind of crazy, insane anti-Semitic pastor who was putting out stuff about how I was the Antichrist because I don't believe in Christ this week. And I thought, wow, what was your first clue? Right, that I don't believe in Jesus. Was it the hat I wear around literally all day? But the reason the Jews don't believe in Jesus is because the Jewish version of the Messiah does not match up with the Christian version of the Messiah. So Jews believe that God does not and cannot take human form. He does not incarnate that way. Jews also don't believe that the Messiah is a God figure. They don't believe that it's God descending to earth to die for the sins of other people. They believe that the Messiah is a political figure. Maimonides talks about certain things that the Messiah is going to have to do, including the rebuilding of the Third Temple, including the recreation of the Davidic monarchy. These are things that Jews believe the Messiah does, but nowhere in there is there a definition of Messiah as God figure. That's a Christian invention. It's not inherent in Jewish belief. Now, it's possible, I mean, I've read all the messianic arguments about where this is foreshadowed in the book of Isaiah and all that. Jews obviously interpret those passages differently, but that's the basic reason. With all that said, my entire argument is that everybody should go to church. I'm not trying to convert anybody to Christianity, to Judaism. Judaism discourages converts, and in the Jewish view, everybody who fulfills 7 basic commandments goes to heaven, the Noahide laws. If you believe in God, if you create courts of law, if you don't eat the flesh of a living animal, you don't participate in theft or sexual immorality, you don't participate in murder, you do those things, you are going to fulfill what you're here to do, and you're good. So I'm more than happy for Christianity to continue spreading. I think it's done an enormous amount of good for the world. I think that it's helped spread monotheism, as Maimonides talks about. And I think that the death of Christianity in the West has been one of the worst developments in human history, actually. So with all that said, I'm very pro-Christian. I am not a Christian.
Ladies and gentlemen, that'll be all of our questions for tonight. Thank you all very much.
Thank you so much. Oh. One more and I'm moving. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. Thank you.